Hello, welcome to week 6 of Analytics for Design. At this point in the game, you should have mined through all of your survey responses and started to analyze the data. And my hope is that some interesting pieces have reached out and grabbed you and you've started to figure out where the story and where the narrative is. So today, we're going to talk about data visualization. What do you do with all that information and those insights, and how do you prepare a story and articulate it in a way that is meaningful and impactful and moving to your audience. So just as a check-in or a quick little reminder, week 6, your homework assignment, or what we're going to be working on this week, is data visualizations, and then updating your final solution design. And then the last thing that you're going to do to finish out this course is to actually tell the story, bring it all together, put it together in a blog post that we'll publish on Medium. And then you're going to take all the information that you found, both your data visualizations and the story that you've created, and you're going to share it with some organizations that you think might find what you did useful and interesting. Okay, so we've done a lot over the course of these 7 weeks. We've jam-packed a ton of stuff into a short period of time. We have figured out what our worthy cause was, we've planned, then we sat down and actually started to design our survey and our approach. We went out and captured and collected data, then we analyzed it. Now we're going to move into data visualization, and then we're going to go into distribution. And at this point, I would ask in my live class, what do you think is the most important of this entire process? What is the most important step or the most important part? And it's a little bit of a trick question, because the reality is that all of these are equally important. Your data visualizations aren't going to be great unless you have an amazing analysis, or you've come up with something that is really interesting to share. And your analysis isn't going to be valid or interesting or helpful unless you did a really solid job on your collection, unless you were able to reach the right target audience, you were able to get enough responses, or you were able to get the right responses from the right people. And you weren't able to do that unless you designed a really great survey and then also worked on the distribution plan. And from there, all of that goes back into ultimately the planning. So I don't know if this analogy is going to hold, but you guys know what those Russian nested dolls are. That's kind of what this process is. All of those, they all nest, and they're all important. I don't know, that was not a very good analogy, but you know what I'm talking about. All of the process matters, and they all build on each other. So my hope is that you have had felt a lot of success in all of the previous steps, and now you're ready to jump into data visualization. So I have another little bit of a trick question for you, but when do you think you start the data visualization process? Most people would say, okay, well, right now, because that's where we're at in this 7-week course. This is the week that we're going to do data visualization. And yes, this is the week that we are actually going to roll our sleeves up and do the data visualization. But the reality is that data visualization actually is important to start thinking about when you're first designing your survey, because you want to think about your end goal, and you want to think about your lines in the sand so that you know the types of questions to ask, so that then you can visualize that data later. Now you might say, well, I didn't have the data, so I couldn't visualize it. But the reality is, when you design the survey, you know what type of information it is that you're looking for. You're just going out and asking for responses so that you can validate or disvaluate, not a word, disprove your hypotheses. So you know what information it is you need, and you can start to think about visualization then. Now, why didn't we talk about data visualization at that point? One, this is an introduction class. I didn't want to overwhelm you, but it is important in the designing process and in the designing phase of creating your survey that is the moment that you actually start to truly think about, what do I want my data visualizations to look like? And I'm going to walk you through an actual example that I recently worked on. So we were hired by a client earlier this year to help them to create a data visualization. And the brief came down to simply this. It was basically 2 words. They wanted us to help them visualize hope, which sounds lofty. So let me explain the scenario or the situation. This organization had 2 separate offices, one in New York and one in Idaho. And these 2 separate offices, the people who worked at these 2 separate offices were having a hard time communicating, and there was a lot of infighting, and they weren't really getting along. So the organization created a one-day offsite in Austin, Texas. Literally, they brought the two different parts of the United States to the center of the United States so that they could try and find some common ground. And they asked us, they hired us as the agency to help them to visualize hope. What could we do so that we could help both the employees of the organization and the leadership of the organization to have a single picture of what was happening and what was going on in their organization. And so that's all we had. We knew that we had about 150 people who were going to be at an offsite in a certain date. And we knew basically the scenario, the situation. They were having some internal cultural struggles, and that they wanted ultimately a single visualization of what was happening in the organization and what we could do. Well, it's not necessarily what we could do, but what the organization could do to address that situation. So my business partner and I, Brad, we sat down literally with a blank sheet of paper. And first, after we got over the oh shit, how are we going to do this? We set out to brainstorm. So we first thought about our end game. Well, what is it that we need to do? We need to, at the very end of this presentation, they need to be able to put up a big slide that is an impressive wow factor and that communicates hope to this organization. And so with that in mind, we started thinking about, well, what do we need to measure? First, let's start there. What do we need to measure? First, we knew that there was a lot of infighting, and then we knew that we needed to measure this alternate potential future, if you will. And there were lots, so we went back and forth. We threw out all sorts of ideas. What if we did it this way? What if we did it this way? And ultimately, we went through a lot of really shitty ideas before we landed on one that we thought was really interesting. And so what we ended up doing was we asked the participants to give us 2 words. And we asked them to answer 2 questions with 2 one-word answers. The first question was, write down a word or phrase that describes the most noticeable emotion you have experienced over the past 30 days. And then the second question was, now think about 2019, describe the emotion you would like to experience most often. So our hypothesis was, again, knowing the situation, that in their current state, most of those words were going to be negative, and in their future potential state, that most of those words were going to be positive. So we captured these words, and I forgot to also tell you this, we did this all live. So when the participants arrived in Austin at the workshop, we asked them these 2 questions. 5 hours later, at the end of this daily offsite, they were going to give a keynote presentation where they needed this visualization. So we captured the data. 5 hours later, we had to turn around and deliver the visualization. Talk about stressful. So we captured this information, and then we did an AI sentiment analysis on the data where we ranked the words that we captured from the most negative to the most positive, and then correlated every individual person's response. So on the left, you can see kind of what our data inputs looked like, the sentiment, and then the confidence variable that was given to us by the AI algorithm. And then you can see that little arrow, and that points to basically how I aggregated the information. And you can see the 50A, 85A, those are the 50A, that's the 50th person who gave us a response. That is their first response. And all of the Bs, so the next, the first B is 25B. So the 25th person who responded, their second response or their answer to think about what they want, the emotion that they want to feel in 2019, their response was no stress. So we took that data, and then this is the visualization that we ended up creating. So let me walk you through this. So on the far left are the most negative emotions that were expressed, and on the far right are the most positive emotions that are expressed. And then the arcs, or the rainbows, connect those responses. So the individuals that have the biggest arcs, I would say they have the biggest delta in change of hope. And the red, we used color also to communicate information. So the red is, anxious, stressed, anxiety, urgency. And then on the far right is green and hope and positivity and possibility. So we used a lot. There are several different layers of visual communication going on here. One, we used the scale. So far left, negative, far right, positive. We used the size of the arc to represent the biggest delta for change. And then we used color also to communicate information. And this was a single snapshot to this organization of what the hopefulness of their employees. So you can see on the far right, there are some people who have just like little jumps, right? So maybe right now they're not feeling anxious or stressed, and in the future they kind of just want to feel the same way. So, and there are some people who you can see those really big arcs. They feel horrible and they want to feel a lot better as their arc makes its way all the way over to the right side. And then there are, a couple people who I would say they don't have a lot of hope. But overall, this gave the organization and the leadership and the employees themselves a really good snapshot of where they currently are and ultimately where they want to go. And this we pulled it off. I think we actually delivered this like 26 minutes early before the person walked on stage. And I have to tell you, this is probably one of the most stressful projects I've ever worked on, because we didn't know for sure. We ran trials and tests with the dummy data to see if the AI was going to work, to see if the data visualization was going to work. And I didn't use a tool to do this data visualization. I did all of this literally by hand. And it was crazy, but it turned out great, and the organization loved it. And in fact, we have used the same process for a few different other organizations. So I'll walk you through what some of those looked like. So the process was the same, a snapshot of what hope looked like. But in this particular instance, you can see that there weren't as many participants, so that the words are a little bit bigger, and you can see that some people had some of the similar responses, which was interesting. But all the other visualizations are the same. Now the colors changed because we were doing this for a different organization and we wanted to use their brand colors. Here's another example of that same experiment run with a different organization at a different time. And you can see that this one had probably quadruple the number of participants. And we also did this one live. Actually, in fact, every time we do this, we have to do it live because there's no way typically to capture the data from the participants beforehand. So you can see some, interesting anomalies on the far left. There's that little tiny red arc. That person is not very happy, and they don't anticipate that things are going to get much better. Now, if I were an organization, I would want to know who that person is. Now, the reality is all of this is anonymous because we wanted people to respond as accurately and as transparently as possible. And then there's some people, we see little green arcs on the far right, and those people don't seem to have any issues with what's going on within an organization. Now, the reality is, if we ran this data across lots of different organizations, across lots of different industries, I think that cross-industry analysis would be really interesting. I'd be curious to see just in general how hopeful people in the workplace are. And I'm sure that there have been lots and lots of studies that have been done for this, but this was a really interesting project to work on. And I wanted to share this with you because this is probably the latest project that I've done that utilizes something similar to what it is we're doing in this class. So let's dig in a little bit more on how we're actually going to create some of these data visualizations and some of the information and the inputs that you need to have. So the first thing I want you to think about is, our end game. What is our objective? So you are going to be visualizing the information that you have, and you're going to be creating a story. And you need to think about, what is the reaction that you want? How do you want people to respond to your data visualizations? Are you asking them to take an action? Are you trying to change a behavior? Are you trying to encourage people to adopt a portion of your solution design? Are you trying to change someone's opinions? The clearer that you are with what it is that you are trying to accomplish, the better your data visualization will be, because you can determine the best way to visualize that so that you can achieve the best outcome. Just like we did in the analyzation or the visualization of hope, we wanted to figure out how could we visualize that so that people could clearly articulate and have a takeaway in one snapshot. You want to think about who is your audience. And your audience may be different than the people that you got your survey responses from, and your audience may also be different than the people that you interviewed. It may not be. This depends on the individual nuances of the topic that you chose. But you need to ask yourself, who is it that you're writing this blog post for, and who is it you're going to be sharing your survey information with? So we always need to know who our audience is so that we can cater our information to this. This is a little bit of marketing, but again, if we're going to be successful in the way that we communicate our information, we need to know who it is that we're talking to. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with this term numerate, but numerate is the same as literate. Well, it's similar to literate. So literate is your ability to read. Numerate is your ability to be able to read the numbers. So you need to gauge what the numeracy of your audience is. Is this a young audience who may not necessarily be very numerate? They might not be able to read numbers and data very well. Or are you talking to a college level audience who are going to be very comfortable with data? And make sure that you're visualizing your data appropriately. Are these people invested in your cause? If someone is invested in your cause, they may spend more time reading a really lengthy blog post that goes into lots and lots of details, that has lots and lots of charts and data. Or you may be talking to an audience who is generally interested in your topic, and they just want the high points. They just want the big nuggets, the big takeaways, the big insights, the big ahas, and they don't want to be bothered with all the nitty-gritty stuff. So who is it that you're writing your blog post for, and then design that accordingly. So you have some decisions to make. Think about who it is that you're going to be writing this for, who you're creating your data visualizations for, and then write to that person and then do your data visualizations according to that audience and what their appetite's going to be for the complexity of both the articulation as well as the data visualizations themselves. Okay, so throughout all of this, we have been aiming for a story. Now you've done some interviews, you have collected data, and you need to unpack and figure out what is the interesting story out of all this. Now we know this over and over again that facts don't stick, that stories do. This is how we communicate as human beings. This is how we pass information on. This is why you remember certain things from your past, because there's a story associated with them. This is why sometimes the things that we learn in school don't stick with us because we're just memorizing and learning facts and statistics. But when there's a story that goes along with it, we remember and hold on to those things so much longer, and they're much more impactful. Not only do we remember them, but they're more interesting in the moment that we're digesting and taking in that information. So think about what is happening to who and tell that story. You might even think about this as a traditional like story arc, the one that you learned in literature in English. What is the exposition, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and the resolution? Tell that story. You interviewed some people. Now you might have hopefully you captured some really interesting stories from that people, and maybe you captured some more interesting nuggets from your data, from your surveys. You can create an alternate persona. So a persona, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this term, but a persona is the articulation of a point of view. It can be based off of a real person. So say, for example, someone that you interviewed was really, really interesting and you want to use their story as a point of understanding to relate to the bigger overarching topic. Like say, let's use homelessness as an example. You might be trying to tackle homelessness in its entirety, but if you just rattle off a bunch of statistics and stats about homelessness, it's not going to make that big of an impact. But let's say you interviewed someone named Jane who was homeless. If you tell Jane's story, people are going to be far more interested in how she feels, what her experience was, why the things that happened to her, and how your solution design is going to improve and impact that based off of all the data and information that you found. So if you can tell a story based off of either a single individual or an aggregate personified version of a person, it's going to be much more impactful. I don't know if that made sense, but if the personas are either based off of a real person or they're based off of kind of an aggregate of lots of different people, and you can pull different pieces and parts from a story. You can tell a story of it like a person in quotes. So this is Jane's story. Jane might not necessarily be a real person, but Jane is maybe all the important or interesting parts of the stories that you captured. I hope that makes sense. So the gold in your data visualizations and in your data analysis is in the comparisons. How does one set of data compare to another set of data based off of the segmentations that you created? So this might be as simple as how do men respond versus women respond, or how does information correlate from this target to this target? What is happening in the data? And recognize that just because it's happening for this group of people might not necessarily mean that it's happening for this group of people. So who is what your articulating true for, and who is it not true for. So you might need to, well, I shouldn't say you might need to, you're going to need to dig beneath the surface to find some really interesting insights. The gems and the gold in your data isn't likely something that's just staring at you in the face. It's probably not it's probably not just the aggregate of the responses from a single question. It is most likely the comparison of the responses from at least two of your questions and how they correlate and intersect. I will just throw out one other thing, to just be conscientious of averages, because sometimes they don't tell the whole story and they can leave out the outliers. So if you have a piece of data that has a really disparate data point group of where there are some outliers in your data, be conscientious of averaging those, because averages can just be really dangerous. They don't often tell the full story. All right, let's talk about good versus bad visualizations. If I were to ask you if this chart is good or bad, what would you say? My hope is that you would say that this is a bad chart. And the reason that it's bad is because the natural progression of responses is out of order. As human beings, we don't really read things, actually. We quickly look for clues, and then we organize things in the way that we think they need to be organized, in the way that they should be organized. So we would quickly look at this and say, strongly agree, agree, and then we might not actually read the rest of it, and we would just assume that it goes down the natural course of progression, which would be strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree. We would think that strongly agree and strongly disagree would be at polars, okay? But when they're displaced, when they're unorganized, it skews the way that we actually take in this information. This is how people can skew the data as they're understanding it and as they're evaluating it. So we want to make sure that we are always playing into the way that people anticipate that information is going to be organized. Here's another example of a bad data visualization. Now, the data in this chart is right. Now, I've corrected at the bottom, strongly agree, agree, disagree, and strongly disagree. But now what is wrong and what is complicated, and it's not necessarily wrong, but what is making this a bad data visualization is that my scale on the left-hand side, my vertical scale, is off, okay? It doesn't need to go to 900 if all of my data falls within the 0 to 100. It makes it really difficult to see the nuances between the different sizes of bar charts, okay? So here's another data visualization that is not awesome. So here I've corrected the vertical axis, but now my no, yes, not always, and sometimes. Why is this a bad visualization? It's bad because what's the difference between not always and sometimes? Most people would make an argument that they are the same. Now, you as the survey designer might, and the way that the question was posed, because we're not looking at this in context, we don't know what the question is, it is possible that not always and sometimes do need to be separate responses. However, it is more than likely that not always and sometimes need to be aggregated. So in order to make this chart better, we would combine the not always and sometimes and see that it does is, based on the people that responded to this, it is exponentially more than the people who said no and the people who said yes. So this data is skewed because we basically have two questions that mean the same thing, but we've broken them out into two separate data points. So be conscientious of that. Here's another example of some bad data visualizations. These are bad for several different reasons. But let's focus on the chart on the left. The chart on the left is really bad because it is really complicated, and there is no way to identify the nuance of the different colors to the key because they are so close. On top of that, the data on this chart doesn't go in order. So I should put an asterisk out there. I think pie charts in general are really bad data visualization. There's always a better way to visualize it. Pie charts are just notoriously hard to capture the information from. If you are going to use a pie chart and for whatever reason you've determined that a pie chart is the best way to visualize something, make sure that you put the data in descending order, meaning the biggest part of your pie chart should be followed by the next biggest part of your pie chart, which is followed by the next biggest part of your pie chart, and so on and so forth, so that as people are reading it, they don't have to try and compare, if there's a small slice of pie up here and then another small slice of pie up here, they have to figure out and determine which one is bigger. And then of course the one on the right, very, very similarly. It is really hard to figure out, okay, which one is February? It looks like it's a orange, and then go down to the pie chart and find that orange chart. I would say the same thing here. The pie pieces are out of order. Now they've been labeled, so it's a little bit easier to compare them. But just in general, these are some bad data visualizations. All right, let's talk about the anatomy of different visualizations. The first piece is figuring out what is it that we're actually measuring. So you need to ask yourself to go back to the data, what it is that you're trying to ultimately communicate. Think about the end result. What do you need to communicate? And then figure out what's the best way to measure that. How many things, also you want to be conscientious of how many things you measure in one chart. It is possible to have several different data inputs and measure multiple things in a chart. It can make the chart more complicated and more confusing. I usually make the argument that those should be separate charts. So you should typically try and compare just two things in a chart. It usually makes the data visualization a little bit easier to digest. Now, there are cases where you want to compare three different things, and the comparison of those three different things is important to visualize in one chart, and that's okay. But the measuring stick you choose to use matters. So really be conscientious and make sure that the way that you're choosing to measure the particular piece of data and the way that you're choosing to visualize that data is really important, okay? Now, closely related to that is what chart are you going to use? There are an unbelievable amounts of different charts out there. Usually we stick to the basics, where we go with pie charts or bar charts or line graphs, and that is okay. You don't need to use a fancy chart visualization unless it is going to be incredibly helpful and beneficial for the communication. Oftentimes people use a fancy chart for the sake of using a fancy chart, but on the receiving end, it's actually a little bit more complicated for the person to even understand. So don't be intimidated by some of these other chart options. However, some of these other chart options might help you visualize your data better. I'm including this sample, or not sample, but I guess this is in and of itself a data visualization chart, to help you try and figure out what type of chart is going to be the best for the type of visualization and information that you're trying to communicate. Now, I will attach this to the Google Slides as well as a PDF, so you don't have to reference the video, but use this if you're struggling trying to figure out, okay, this is the data that I have. Now, what type of chart is going to be best to visualize it? This chart is a little bit of a cheat sheet, and it will help you figure that out. But again, going back to the chart, the type of chart that you use to help measure and communicate the data matters. So here's an example of the same pieces of data just visualized in two different ways. And this is just an example that I found online, but you can see here that in the first, on the left, it's communicated as a pie chart, and on the right, it's communicated as a kind of a progressive bar chart, or sequential bar chart. And it makes so much more sense, and it's more cleanly explained on the chart on the right. All right, color. Color theory matters. It matters because of what it is that we're trying to communicate. And the name of the game is trying to tell a story and to get people to have a takeaway from what it is that we've captured. And the color that you choose to use in your charts matters. Different colors have different meanings in different cultures, but I'm going to base this off of our Western culture and the associations that we have with different colors here. So when you are thinking about the various colors that you're going to use in your charts, don't just go with the default. Excel or Google Sheets is going to give you a default color chart. You're going to need to go into those charts and change the colors so that they are representative of what it is that you're trying to communicate. So here are some examples of how color can be used to communicate a little bit differently. You can use the density or the tone of color to communicate scale. So you might use a really dark version of a color to represent intensity or frequency or mass, and then a very light version of the color to communicate the opposite. Or you can use a qualitative color scheme where you are assigning a color with a certain meaning. So the chart on the right uses color to represent race, okay? Color is also incredibly important because you want to be conscientious of, one, the biases that are going into the colors that you're choosing to use, and also just the way that, again, we read color in our Western culture. Here are 3 different ways that color can be used to communicate. So, gender. Whether you believe in it or not, colors can communicate and are often associated with certain genders. So, pink and red are often associated with women and femininity. Blue are often associated with males and masculinity. And again, whether you agree or disagree with, we could go down a really big rabbit hole here, but just be conscientious that those colors are going to communicate something to your audience. You wouldn't want to swap those colors because that could potentially have an impact on the way that people are actually receiving the information. But instead, you might want to choose 2 different colors altogether, and that would be perfectly acceptable. Just be conscientious that the choices that you're making in design matter. The chart on the bottom left is representative of race, and they have chosen some really arbitrary colors to represent that, and then they've used a key at the bottom. Race and gender are, and politics, which is my chart on the right, on the bottom right. Race, gender, politics, all of those kind of potentially hot button topics that reference very specific colors matter. And you just need to be conscientious of the way that you're using them and what those colors are going to communicate. And then beyond you and your own beliefs, think about the way that your audience is going to interpret and read them, and could it potentially skew the data and or communicate the opposite of what you're actually intending to communicate. All right. Sorting. We talked about this a little bit already, but just again, make sure that you are sorting your information appropriately. So here's some examples of 2 charts. The one on the left is sorted poorly in a couple of different ways. One, on the far left, the average, awful, excellent, mediocre, that doesn't make any sense in the way that we would naturally read that information. We would want to see some sort of gravity. So either the excellent at the top and the awful at the bottom. But when they get really mixed like this, it becomes hard to digest that information. On top of that, the scale, the horizontal scale at the bottom is off as well. We've gone 5%, 15%, 30%, and 50%. It's not incremental, and it makes it a little bit more hard to read the information. So the correct way to do that would be to scale both the vertical and the horizontal from excellent to average, awful, and mediocre. I would make an argument that awful should be low, mediocre. But maybe they've chosen to scale these or to represent them based off of least to most, or if you're going from top to bottom, most to least. And then they've adjusted the scale at the bottom to go incrementally from 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50%. So be conscientious of how you're sorting your data. Oftentimes, the way that the data comes out of Google Sheets, it's missorted. So you have to go in and do some manual reorganization sometimes before you're doing your actual data visualization. So be conscientious of that. Another important thing to think about is labeling. Again, the way that the program that you're choosing to use spits out the charts and the bars and the graphs is oftentimes really ugly and overcomplicated. So you need to go in and you're going to need to simplify, adjust the colors, sometimes adjust the fonts, and adjust the labeling to make sure that you are communicating as best you can. Here's another example where labeling is completely skewing the data. So anyone who is looking at this chart, the one on the left is clearly trying to communicate a point of view by at every single touch point. So both with the label, the heading, the subheading, and then the specific call out that they've chosen to identify. So the frutastic sale season and strawberry season never looked better. Anyone who knows anything about reading data can see that, yes, June looked awesome, but things are on the decline. So it is a much more unbiased representation of the data with the chart on the right. They're simply saying, these are the strawberry sales by month, okay? Here's another example. The difference between these charts is one is just really over-labeled, and the one on the right is just simplified. They both have the exact same pieces of data, but the one on the left, it's hard to look at, to compare the two. One, the variety of colors, the photographs, the the logos. There's just a lot going on. So be conscientious of streamlining and being really mindful and meaningful with the way that you choose to label your charts. All right. So in addition to the graphs and the charts that are going to be automatically output from Google Sheets or Google or Excel, there are an unbelievable amount of other data visualization tools out there, and I don't have the time in the day, and nobody wants to watch that video for me to go through all of those different tools, but I am going to share with you a couple that you might be interested in trying if you want to push yourselves a little bit more and not use just the default charts, I suppose. So the first is a tool called Raw Graphs, and there's an example on the left. This is actually data visualization that I did for the College of Innovation and Design. And the goal of this chart was to communicate the relationships that the College of Innovation and Design has within their programs. So at the center, and there was a key that went along with this that helped the communication, but at the center is the College of Innovation and Design. Around that are the different programs, and then spidering off of those were the difference between the university partners and the external partners. And then they were broken out even further from there. So this shows all the relationships, both on campus and off campus, that are part of the College of Innovation and Design. And this was created for their annual report. And I used this tool, Raw Graphs. I will just tell you that this is a pretty powerful tool, and it takes a little bit of time to get used to, but basically you take all of your various data points and you can input it into this tool and choose various different chart outputs. So the only thing I can say is the best way to learn it is to jump into it and start messing around with it and see what kind of interesting visualizations you can come out with from that. Again, don't go into it just creating a really cool looking chart. It needs to be meaningful. Okay, so you want to think about, what is it that I'm measuring? What is it that I'm trying to communicate? And what is the best way to visualize that? But this is a pretty badass tool. So try it out if you want something a little bit more interesting than a traditional bar chart. Here are some other examples of that tool being used. This one is used similarly to the way that I used in the IDEA certificate, the College of Innovation and Design annual report, where it's showing relationships and correlation. The tool does charts that look like this as well. Now, mind you, the output from that tool don't look this beautiful. The data the chart itself has been exported, and then a designer has gotten their hands on it and has made it look this beautiful. But what you're seeing in the center of this graph is what the tool will output for you. There is also IBM Watson if you're looking for some sort of machine learning or sentiment analysis. This is probably arguably one of the most powerful AI tools that is available for anyone to use for free. This one is a bit more complicated. You have to know a little bit of coding to use this. But I had some students last year who decided they wanted to dive in and try it, and they came out with some really, really interesting visualizations that were incredibly communicative. And they made both their blog posts and then the communication to the nonprofit organizations so much more powerful, because this is the type of data analyzation, the data analysts that these organizations would never be able to afford. And it just takes a little bit of messing around. So depending upon how technically savvy you are and how much you want to push yourselves, you might jump into IBM Watson and try a little AI. We're going down the scale a little bit in complexity. There are lots and lots of different world cloud generators out there. When I use a word cloud generator, this is the one that I use. It's really simple to use, and it has lots of different, you can change a lot of the different variables to output really interesting visualizations. So here you can see, for example, I've gone and put in, fake data, but I outputted it into the shape of a dollar sign. Perhaps that would be meaningful for whatever it is I was trying to communicate. So, I also wanted to share with you, just to stretch your thinking a little bit more, some examples of some just really killer expert level data visualizations. This one I found not too long ago and thought it was really, really incredible. I can't imagine the data that went into creating this, but I think the output is incredibly interesting. So what they're trying to communicate is movies that were based on a true story, how much of that was in fact actually true and how much of it was embellished and or made up. So if I look at the scale, the things that are the darkest blue were true and the things that are the darkest pink were the most made up. So you can see the various movies that they've chosen here. So The Social Network, it was largely true with some embellishments. Rush, largely true. The King's Speech probably looks like it has some of the most, well, actually, if I go back to the chart on the left, the Imitation Game looks like it was the most made up, even though it was technically based on a true story. So interesting data visualization. Here's another interesting one that that is quickly communicative based off of the way that it's organized and designed. So they're looking at mortality rates, the death by heart disease based off of, and this is an interactive data visualization. So obviously I'm showing you a static screenshot of this, but so what we're looking at here is between the years 2011 to 2015, what did mortality rates look like? What did heart disease mortality rates look like in the US? Looks like orange is the most grave, whereas black is the least number of deaths in 100,000 persons. So when I look at Idaho, not too shabby. Yeah, kind of interesting. Here's another really simple data visualization, but I like the way that they used the shape of a heart to communicate this information. They could have easily done this in a bar chart and it would have communicated the same way, but we just get a little bit more narrative and a little bit more storytelling and a little bit more visual interest by using the hearts. So this piece of data is basically talking about where people are more likely to meet their love interest. And it looks like work is the name of the game. So I don't know how you feel about that, but I thought that was interesting. Here's another fantastic data visualization. So this is the number of unique words used with an artist's first 35,000 lyrics. So who were the most articulate rappers, or of the rap community, who used the most unique words? And I think it's, for comparison's sake, I love that they called out where Shakespeare would be and where Moby Dick would be. Really interesting. Here is another graph. This is similar to the true, not true from based on a true story movies. So they're using the color blocking to show how the most creative people, again, according to this chart, the most creative people, what they do in their daily lives. So you can really quickly see the comparison. So the orange is creative work, and you can see throughout someone's day of these creative people where they put their creative work, and the plot across the top is timelines. So you can see, some people are with 12 a.m. to 2 a.m. is some of their most creative time. But for the rest of the people, it looks like it's scattered throughout the day, and some people have multiple sessions of creativity. Looks like Pablo Picasso had really early mornings and late nights of creativity, slept most of the afternoon, ate and had leisure, and then got back to some creativity. So again, just an interesting data visualization. All right, I'm going to walk you through the homework assignment. And then I'm also, after I get done walking you through this, I'm going to cut in a video of Cameron Crowe, who was the guest speaker from last class. And he is walking us through some data visualizations that he has done. And I think it will just be helpful to get another point of view and to see the way that a data analyst is thinking about the way that they're visualizing their data. So this is your homework assignment for this week. You're going to create data visualizations, and I think that should take you about an hour and a half. And then you're going to take both the narrative and the story and your data visualizations and everything you've come up with at this point, and I want you to update your solution design. So now you have even more input and more insight into your worthy cause, how does this information impact your solution design? So this is your final solution design. What badass idea do you have that is a business, a product, a service? What ideas do you have to combat the issues as it relates to your worthy cause? I think that should take you about an hour and a half. You can write that up, you can sketch it up, you can do a prototype. I will leave it up to you to determine how you want to represent your updated solution design. I will just say the measuring stick that I'm going to use and that I'm asking you to use is the same measuring stick that I've always used and that we talked about at the very beginning of this class is, will this impress someone? And is this my best work? So if you can answer yes to both of those questions, because people always ask me, well, what do you want for the solution design? I am leaving it up to your own agency. That's part of the professional world. I want an updated solution design. You ask yourself, will this impress someone? And is this my best work? If you can say yes to both of those things, then you've checked the box. The last thing I want you to do is I want you to share your data visualizations and your updated solution design with 2 people, and I want you to document their feedback. Now, I'm leaving it up to just any 2 people, and again, I'm leaving this up to you to determine. Find people who you think that you value their opinion, you value their perspective, somebody that you think is going to be able to give you some honest feedback, and then you might need to adjust both your data visualizations and your solution design based off of the information that you get back from them. Okay, so don't do your homework, get pieces of feedback, and then not do anything with that feedback. The whole point of feedback is so that you can kind of test and proof that what you're doing actually makes sense and is viable and valuable. Okay, so that's what I want you to do. In addition, in your Google Docs, so what effects do you want this research to have on the readers? So I want you to answer that question. Answer your research questions, and I want at least 5 really interesting data visualizations. Explain what the readers should learn from each of those data visualizations, and then based off of your learnings, finalize your visual solution design and put it into your doc. Okay? I've gotten this question a couple of times. If the callouts or what is written in the master Google Doc that you downloaded at the very beginning of the semester is different than this, go off of this. Go off of what is written that I'm talking about in this video and go off of what is written in the actual assignment that is posted most recently. Sometimes I change course a little bit throughout the 7 weeks to adjust for just various variables, and that Google Doc I created at the very beginning of the 7 weeks, and so it is the most outdated. So if there's any confusion between the video, the way that it's written in the actual assignment post, or the Google Doc, go with the most recent piece of information. And I'm sorry if there have been any confusion on that point. I'm making note to keep the Google Doc as simple as possible so that I can adjust course and not cause confusion. So that's my bad, and I'm sorry. So after this, like I said, I'm going to cut in Cameron Crowe, and he'll walk us through several different data visualizations. If you just want some more examples, and if you don't, all good. That's it. Good luck. I am so excited to see where you guys go with this. So far, I've been so impressed, both with the worthy causes, the thoughtfulness, the thinking, the creativity, and the innovation that has come out from your various projects. If you, as always, if you have any questions, if you need anything, please email me. I will say this again, I cannot see you if you're suffering. Please don't suffer in silence. Don't bang your head against the wall. Try and figure it out. Do your very best to figure it out. And if you can't figure it out, don't stay stuck. Reach out and ask a classmate, ask me, post in Google Classroom. But please just don't stay stuck. That's a horrible place to be. And we're almost done. 1 more week, and I'll see you in a week, or rather, you'll see me in a week. Have a good one. Okay, I'm going to pass this off to Cameron Crowe, who is going to walk through some data visualizations based off of projects that he has done, and I hope it will be helpful for you to see and hear from an actual data analyst to see how they have articulated and thought through all of those variables when it comes to all the anatomy of data visualization. So how do you measure, what chart do you choose, color theory, sorting, and labels. And take it away, Cameron.
So what I was thinking about when I made this chart was this is overlapping two different questions to show like how does one kind of the way you answered this question affect the way you answered the other question. And then I was very like, should always think about which colors you're using, not just different colors to show the difference between answers, but like whenever you can, like what are the connotations that certain colors have, that people have with colors. So, and so to here like was red and green, people like think of those as opposite ends of the spectrum, and then variance in between is, like gradients of them. So, extremely well, like well is kind of a, what's the word? It's like a normative, something that's like should or better or worse, or like it's a word like that. So green is often associated with good. So I wanted to use that for like extremely well, and then not at all well is like a bad or like red. So I wanted to make it clear so that you don't have to kind of be like, what's this color mean? Like if you see red and green, it's kind of like good and bad, and like you kind of can assume stuff without having to figure things out. And everybody will always assume stuff, so try to like play into their assumptions if you can, so they don't have to like calibrate themselves on every chart.
Can I make a comment on that?
Yeah.
Well, think about the context of the information that you're communicating as well. So, and you want to, like branding comes into play. If you're hired to work for an organization and have certain brand colors, oftentimes you want to use and leverage their own brand colors. Unless the information that you're using is painting some of their information in a negative light, then you probably don't want to use their brand colors, and you want to maybe go with something that's more neutral, like a grayscale. Also, to Cam's point, we're conditioned in Western culture to associate certain colors with certain things, good or bad. Gender is often color coded, and to Cam's point, green is often attributed to growth and positivity, and going red, bad, negative, danger. But with the goal here is to communicate information and go for comprehension and understanding, then you want to leverage people's inherent understanding of color theory.
Yeah. Whether you agree with it in general or not, like most people will read something into it. So you might as well not try to like flip the conventions around and risk losing people and having them get the wrong idea.
Here's an example, like going back to gender. Like gender is oftentimes color coded, agree with it or not. I tend to try to avoid that, where I'm not painting things that are feminine as pink or female as pink, and et cetera, et cetera. So, but I wouldn't flip it, because that would be confusing to most audiences. So I would probably go to just a grayscale neutral, or I would use a pattern. I would say the vertical stripes are male and the polka dots are female, or whatever. So there are things that you can do to get around that, but just keep in mind that your ultimate goal is communication and understanding based on the people who are reading it.
And if you're going to like not use a convention, don't half use the convention. Like she said, she wouldn't flip it, and make guys pink and girls blue or something like that, whatever it would be. But if you don't want to use those two, don't like keep guys blue and then change one. Like use two colors that are typically not used with like gender at all, if you don't want to like have assumptions, or if you're going to use a color, not a pattern or something. Okay, next one. I'll just explain it because I've got lots of these, and then you can ask questions instead of asking everyone to read it and think about it. But so here I didn't use green and red because I didn't want to put like a value statement on this as much. So the question was about like what's a satisfactory graduation rate, and I didn't want to imply like I have ideas about what a good graduation rate is and like what's satisfactory for the state of Idaho, but other people have different ones, and oftentimes I don't want to associate like, here's the correct answer. These are the people that got it right, and these are the people that got it wrong. So I'm doing like gradients, like darker means higher and lighter means lesser. And I'm kind of comparing that across, different groups of respondents. And then the sorting here, I always, like I said, like the sorting is always important because like the same sorting on all of these, but also, the darker, it goes darker to lighter, and it's not like intermixed like the light ones in the middle or anything like that, where you have to really kind of strain to see it. So you can just look and like the lightest is on the top, and if we want to just compare the lightest, we can see that visually. Questions about this? Okay, I often like to, at the beginning of all my analysis, show what the respondents, like the sample was by demographic, because unless you know kind of what are the type of people that we heard from, that can really color the results. If we only heard from women, maybe we should assume that these results could look very different for men. Or we have to at least like have a much bigger grain of salt than if we see that these are like, pretty close together. Or if we only heard from people in their 20s and 30s and didn't hear from people in their 70s or 80s, that's like good to know also. And geography. So depending on what you're analyzing and what demographics you've collected, probably a good idea to do something simple, which is just like column charts like this. Column charts are easier to read than, like I said last time, I think, than pie charts, because the human eye is much easier at like comparing lengths than it is like widths of like slices. So, we can all probably see at a glance that 50s is higher than 40s, but if you look at that in a pie chart, it would probably look almost exactly the same. You wouldn't be able to tell. And then, the sorting is important too. This is sorted by age, so we don't have to, read if that was all mixed up, which is which. Then these are sorted descending, just by count, based on county. And then usually I'll group other and put it on the end to show, this is one example where like I like to put it on the end to note it so that it like kind of goes against the pattern, because this is not the same as Twin Falls, right? This is a combination of lots of different counties. So this is one reason where I'm like actually going against convention to kind of signal that this is something else a little bit. Questions about this? Okay. Okay, this is one where I used green, but not with red, because it wasn't like a good and bad type thing. This is actually, the question was like, would you pay more? So I was using green as like dollars. So, more green, like more money, less green, less money. So this was showing like, based on how often you fly, would you, like what percent of people would be willing to pay like quite a bit more, like 50% more for a direct flight or for a nonstop flight. And that basically showed, like, as this yellow is saying you wouldn't pay more. So there's people in each of these groups, people that frequent flyers and people that never fly that wouldn't ever pay more for a nonstop flight. But you can see that group gets bigger as people fly less often. So you don't, if this is a big part of your life, you probably feel like it's a better use of your money to kind of save the time flying, for instance. Okay. Majority and minority. So this was a survey that I did about, I think, respect. It was kind of about discrimination, which groups feel discrimination, which groups don't. So this is kind of a, this chart is sort of like this one, the samples. I wanted to show like of the people, like I kind of put all these into like what's the majority versus the minority in society. So the majority, and I believe this is true, but the majority of society doesn't have a disability. But so I wanted to show like how many people did we hear from that would be considered a minority on that category for all of these. So this was an example where I used labels. I don't really know why I use labels, but sometimes it can really like, and who thinks that, I think that if you use labels, this is a little easier to read like what this is than if there's a legend at the bottom, I think. Like this requires more thought to like go down here and see like what is dark green and then look up there versus like if it's just kind of on the top of it. So can be easier. It's also possible to do this because there's a lot less values like in here. Like there's so many more things. There would be lots of labels and it would look really noisy compared to this one. There's only really 2 categories versus like the ones where I didn't know which ones they were. Questions about that? Okay, now here is kind of another way to segment. So this is these are stacked bar charts where this is saying like the proportions of people that answer different way per each of these like categories. This is another way to do it. So in this one, it was the same survey, kind of like I manufactured like a dimension which I called a minority count. So I looked at like, here's how like the respondents were across all of these designations. By like, were they like a religious majority or minority? This one's kind of weird though because the majority is the smaller one, right? I think I considered this like Protestant Christian or just Christian in general, and this was all the people that weren't Christian. So each of these are like singularly smaller than this one, but together they add up to be bigger. Anyway, you can be considered like any one respondent could be a majority on everything, or they could be a minority on everything, or they could be considered a minority on one thing, like they're white and they are straight, but they have a disability, and they're not poor, and they're a Christian or something like that. That I considered to be like one minority status. So I was able to calculate like how many minority statuses certain people have and use that to break down how often they felt disrespected. So on this chart, what I wanted to really highlight was the people that feel disrespect every day. Was there a difference in the way people responded if they like aren't a minority at all, or if they're a minority on kind of a couple different counts, or if they're a minority on basically several or most counts? This like this whole idea of like being a minority on several counts is something that's called like intersectionality. Like we're not all just like one category of things. We're like lots of categories of things, and you could basically face more challenges to society, the more ways you're different. So this was a way to show like the people that were, more different did at a higher percentage say that they feel disrespected every day. But this is kind of a noisy chart, honestly. Like I could really focus on that quite a bit more, and maybe this was like this part on its own is really the like, maybe that's the money chart. Like this stuff isn't as important. So I could really focus more on that instead of showing the whole thing.
So if I'm reading this correctly, is this, I'm just curious.
Mm-hmm.
Is this saying 0%? So
no, those are people without a minority, like
so there's
no minorities.
No minorities, and they don't feel disrespected. But is that saying 0 or is that like 3?
That's like that's like 3. So like 3% of the people that don't have any minority exposure or minority counts, like say they feel discrimination every day, because there's a lot of people with privilege that still think that they're being discriminated against a lot. but the higher amount of that group for one and number two is like less often than monthly you feel discrimination. Anyway, the fact that there is a question about that means that this probably isn't a very straightforward chart. And it's obviously a lot easier to interpret a chart like this when there's kind of like text that says, here's the big finding in this chart. So if I really wanted to make it pop on its own without any kind of writing or kind of highlighting what's in here, I think that this is probably showing just this would be more useful. None of this would be distracting.
Sometimes when I'm reading data visualization within the context of an article, I've seen people do this in Brent Levitt when they'll say, this is how to read this chart.
Yeah, often at the bottom here is really good.
Outside of the narrative, you have just a little call out that says how to read this chart. And that's literally just a little walkthrough as if they were explaining to me how to read it.
Yep, totally. So here's one that I told Sadie about that basically, this is kind of like this one here, this money chart is, so I asked people like how often, like what group are you? Like do you have a disability, yes or no? Do you, but then like, do you think people with disabilities are discriminated against? So then I could segment like, is there a difference between if you have a disability or not? The way you answer, like, do people with disabilities face discrimination? There's a big difference. Like the people that do have a disability, we're twice as likely to say, yes, people with disabilities are regularly disrespected than people that don't. So that's kind of what I would expect. Like especially because like disabilities are some of the things that are maybe less visible. Like they're not maybe on the surface. Like most people know, kind of have a guess about, race just by looking at somebody. And then that's something that's like more people are thinking about more often. Whereas you might look at somebody and not know that they have a disability. So that's like something that might float under the radar. So like if you have a friend that has a disability, or if you yourself have a disability, you might have a totally different idea of like, do those people face discrimination than people that don't? Anyway, this was really the highlight of that chart. So maybe like, again, this didn't have to be here necessarily, but it helped that in the context of the write-up, it really explained this and showed like that this is the part that matters. And I often actually caption my charts with like a link to my YouTube video where I'm actually talking about this chart and like, here's what I see and here's like what stands out. Here's one about using internet segmented by age. So like this was I asked about like how often do you use internet? Basically like constantly, a few times a day, about once a day, or like a few times a week. And I was surprised to see that like people 70 or higher are like at similar proportion, at least these people that found this survey online and participated on it were saying that they use it constantly as much as people in their teens and 20s were. So this was one way I kind of compared that. And again, I used green to kind of show like a higher number of it, and then a lighter kind of opposite color to show like the difference. Like, doesn't use it frequently, uses it constantly, like lots and little kind of. And this is like how often do you use internet based on kind of where you use it from, like at home, on a phone, at work or school, or in public places. And of the respondents, like green being use it, often, really often, versus red like never. And people showed that they don't use internet public places that much. So I was kind of showing like, trying to show which ways you can use the internet are more common, which aren't. Okay, here's a different kind of chart. So this is a map visualization. This is not something that is as easy to do on Google Sheets, but like I used Tableau, which is a data visualization tool that makes this really easy. So I put these next to each other because on the one here, it was showing like how many people aren't, on average, like respondents thought are not accessing the internet regularly. But that is important to pair with like the responses. So this kind of shows like how much confidence we can have in this number, because in Ada County we had 170 people respond, so that maybe that 17% is closer to the truth than maybe Bear Lake County, where we only heard from one person. So like that's why I showed those together, kind of as a confidence measure. And here's a kind of how sometimes I caption things. On the left, more green equals more access, more red equals less access. Don't forget sample sizes to know kind of how much confidence. In this chart, I used brown, degrees of like brown to kind of show age. So the lighter got, the more, the older. Anybody know I might have done that? Anybody can get in my head? People's hair usually gets lighter as they get older. Okay, so here is an example of a very complicated chart that shows a lot of data in one view. This isn't so much a good chart for showing, like the money chart, like we talked about, like this. Like maybe this is like the main takeaway that I want, in which case maybe I want to show that on its own. Like here's what you need to take away, and here's what I want you to feel. I want you to feel that people that have disabilities know better about the discrimination that this group feels than people that don't. Like, and there's a big difference here, so maybe you need to be more aware of that yourself. So that's like the agenda and the objective. Like that's maybe the main takeaway. Versus a chart like this is showing like, here's a bunch of things, and like this is like a reference. This is like an index, and you could find like 30 things in this chart that you could interpret. So this is showing what are the worst things about the internet by age group. So I had people rank like which things they think are the worst. So like this was a ranking question. So the higher the bar shows like the higher this group ranked these problems. So data security, this was the main takeaway from this chart, was the older you are, probably the more concerned you are about data security. Like and this is exactly what I would have expected, and then seeing the data kind of have a nice upward trend based on age felt like a good confirmation. One way to interpret this is older folks typically, like they remember days when like everything wasn't out in the open, and like people were getting hacked left and right, and you had like more of an expectation of privacy, and that nobody knew what your personal information, when it was all based on mail or letters or things like that. Versus people that grew up in this kind of digital age, they don't really have as much of an expectation of privacy, and that like, yeah, they're going to get hacked and their credit card number is going to be stolen like basically once a year, and that's just life. So yeah, you can see kind of, this was the one that really stood out. Like it had a nice, and I often don't use correlation. That's something that people use all the time. I don't like to use that because I think it's technical people have a very technical definition of what correlation means. That means like statistical correlation, like a correlation rate. Like this, if this goes up, then this goes up too. Often people use it kind of loosely. So I just steer clear of it and try to use more like, in order for me to not be misunderstood, or a technical person might hear one thing and think one thing, and a non-technical person might hear something and hear something different, I just say like, these appear to be connected, or something simpler like that is my personal preference. But these other ones, don't appear to have like a linear, like a direct connection. Like as this goes up, this goes up. Yeah.
So, is it ranked? So do they have to go through like 1 through
Yeah.
6?
Yep. So these are like, this is like a weighted average across that age group.
It's like 5 and 5.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that could be an improvement, like that there's a label, the label, access labels include all possible options. So I think that like it was 1 through 6. So number, the higher the number on average would be considered the highest for like ranked priority. So yeah, so the pros of this chart are like, you can look at a lot of different things and like find a lot of, like you can compare, the 10s and 20s, and you can see kind of like what they thought was the worst, but you can also compare, like you can check a whole bunch of research questions in this one chart. Good at showing a lot of things, but it's not really good at like drawing your attention to one thing. So like, that's one thing this is bad about, but it's like a reference. Like it's almost like an encyclopedia page. You can look up tons of things in there. So, but for instance, that there's a question and there's like, that I'm spending so much time explaining it means that it's like not as intuitive, like what's the story here? We'll skip this one. Okay, here's another one that's like very complex, but there's a lot of things you can check in here. So what I'm looking at here is kind of, I asked everybody to say like, would you support higher taxes if it helped you or your family or your friends or someone you don't know or someone in need or the environment? You can answer like no, probably not, probably, or yes. So like which things qualify to you for like raising taxes? And then I wanted to compare how like Democrats answer compared to Republicans compared to people that say I'm neither Republican nor Democrat. And you can see in this chart, like it's not popping out maybe. You're just seeing a lot of colors and a lot of things, and I'm a little overwhelmed. But if you dig into it, you can find some really big things, such as for Democrats, this is almost entirely green, which means like, yeah, I would probably support increasing taxes if it helped any of these people, which is what you would assume with Democrats. They typically are for like higher taxes, more like social services. Versus Republicans, there's a lot bigger red or orange, which means like, no, I probably wouldn't support increasing taxes if it helped any of these people. But then you can see like this one pops. Okay, so there's more green up for the Republicans here than on the other ones. What is that? It's for someone in need. So they'd be more likely to want to raise taxes, though like not most of them, but on average, they'd be more open to it to help somebody in need than if it helps them or their family. So like, I expected people would be most motivated by their self-interest than for kind of altruism, but it looked like for both groups, altruism kind of mattered more, or the environment mattered a lot, even more than that to Democrats. But then like you can see that the people that there doesn't appear to be as much different, like the red and orange looks almost the same between the neither and the Republicans. So in Idaho, maybe that means like you don't like Republican Party, but like you're more like them than the Democrats in this way. So this is, again, there's a lot in here and you can check a lot of stuff, but that's a pro. But the con is it's hard to tell like a story in here. There's lots of stories in here, but it's hard to know which one matters. So one way you can kind of help with that is like to annotate it and like show, like put a box around this, like look here and look here or something like that. Like you can kind of annotate a chart to draw attention to something in particular. And here's another example of using colors because of connotations, like political connotations. Blue being Democrat, red being Republican, and you can kind of see this type of thing. Maybe on average, it looks, kind of even, but if you look at The amount of people that said like arming teachers, like giving teachers guns would help prevent gun violence. There's more Republicans that are saying, yeah, it'd be likely to prevent gun violence. And it's almost exactly the opposite for Democrats. They think like it's very unlikely. So there's like two charts here with very little overlap. And then the neithers are kind of across the board, but they think it's less likely overall.